Erratas are used to fix mistakes once they've already gone to print. Usually, this is used on cards after a rules change has changed the functionality of the card, or sometimes, in rare cases, to fix a card that was too powerful when it was first printed. However, sometimes Wizards makes mistakes that require immediate attention, and have to errata a card right after printing. Today, we're going to go over the most interesting of these instances, the times when Wizards has had to fix a mistake that they made on a card that had just been released. Starting us off at number 10, we have Oboro Envoy. As printed, this is a 1/3 Moonfolk wizard with a mana cost of 3 and 1 blue. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach. It has the ability where you can pay 2 and return a land you control to your hand to give target creature -X/-0, where X is the number of cards in your hand. The errata added one simple line of text to the card that was accidentally left off, until end of turn. Magic doesn't really do effects that permanently change the stats or characteristics of a card without something to help keep track of it. Basically, every effect that permanently gives a creature a stat boost or an ability uses some kind of counters, or is something like an ore or an equipment that stays on the board. This was always intended to only last until the end of turn, but a simple clerical error left the card needing an errata. Funnily enough, the card is so weak and so unfun to play that it's never been reprinted. So the only version of this card that exists has the incorrect text. For whatever reason, until end of turn seems to be a bit of a text that Wizard messes up on cards fairly often. 2 other cards made to print without the until end of turn clause that they were supposed to have printed on them. Invert Invent is a split card, which is a bit of a can of worms all on its own. It's essentially 2 cards at once, letting you cast either the invert or invent half from your hand for their cost. If you look at the invert half of the card, you'll see a similar mistake to the one of Oboro Envoy. Invert forgets to tell you that the stat switches return to normal at the end of the turn. This is an especially big deal because power and toughness switching is one of the stat changing effects that requires the most rules knowledge to use properly. But we're not here to talk about layers again. Similar to Oboro Envoy, Invert Invent only has 1 printing, so there isn't a fixed version of the card available. The final card that Wizards just forgot to write the end of turn clause on is Blood Vial Purveyor. This card also has a lot of abilities, but the one with the mistake is the final one. Whenever Blood Vial Purveyor attacks, it gets +1/+0 for each blood token the defending player controls. This buff is also only supposed to last 1 turn. This is probably the funniest mistake of this kind, as the card actually was reprinted in Innistrad Double Feature, but it still has the exact same mistake on it. Double Feature was a mashup re-release of the 2 newest standard sets at the time, so it was locked in for print at about the time as the original print of Purveyor. The reprint was released only 2 months after the original, after all. Still, the card technically has 4 separate printings across 3 different versions in the original release and reprint, and all of them have the same error. It's also the most powerful and highest rarity card with this mistake, making it stick out so much more than the other cards with this issue. Hopefully, Wizards has learned to look for the line until end of turn on cards like this, because this is still by far the most common source of Day 0 erratas. And at number 9, we have Zaffai Thunder Conductor. As printed, this is a 1/4 human shaman with a mana cost of 2, 1 blue and 1 red. It has the ability where, whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, you scry 1. Then, if the spell had a mana value of 5 or greater, you make a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. And finally, if that spell had a mana value of 10 or more, Zaffai Thunder Collector deals 10 damage to a random opponent. The mistake here is pretty subtle, and essentially irrelevant to gameplay. The card says that Zaffai Thunder Collector deals damage to your opponent, which is strange because the name of the card is Zaffai Thunder Conductor. Essentially, whoever typed out this card's ability just put the wrong name in the card's text for whatever reason. This didn't actually affect gameplay in any way, as whenever a card uses its name in its text, it's replaceable with the text this card. This is why cards like Sakashima the Imposter, which copies a card but keeps its old name, will still be able to use all the abilities of whatever card it copied, regardless of whether they refer to the name of said card. Still, despite this not really mattering, it's definitely not good to have an error like this on a card. This is another card that hasn't gotten a reprint either, so the only versions of this card that exist are the ones with its old unerrata text. As far as the power of the card goes, it was designed for Commander and it shows. While the abilities are fine, they're not good enough to make the card worth casting in any format with only 20 life. The high upside, if you do happen to go into a long game, however, makes it a powerful option for your commander. Zaffai is one of the smallest Day 0 erratas given to a card, and the fact that it makes it onto this list at all mostly shows how rare these kinds of mistakes are. And at number 8, we have Animate Object. This is a sorcerer with a mana cost of 4 and 1 blue. As printed, it has the effect where you get 7 tickets. You then take an inanimate object you own from outside the game, put a power and toughness sticker on it, Then you may also put a name sticker, an art sticker, and or an ability sticker on it. Then you put that onto the field as a creature. Stickers are a mechanic that were included in Infinity and were widely disliked by the community. Essentially, they allowed you to permanently change the characteristics of a card, and many of them cost tickets to use. This mechanic is mostly tangential to the mistake made on the card. When they errata'd Animate Object, they specified that the creature you produce was a creature token rather than just an undefined creature. This largely doesn't matter, though it does help specify a few rulings. If the creature that you make ever leaves battlefield, like all other tokens, it will simply stop existing. And it also means it will get buffed by creatures like Intangible Virtue. The funniest thing about this whole errata is that Animate Object is one of the cards from Infinity that isn't legal for tournament play, denoted by the acorn symbol at the bottom of the card. So Wizards saw that they had printed a card whose rulings would be unclear, people played it outside of competitive settings, and decided it was a big enough issue to go back and change the card's text to clarify the rulings. This is especially strange because there are several cards from the set that aren't tournament legal specifically because the rules don't work with them. For example, Far Out simply doesn't work with cards like Outlaw's Merriment, which is why it had to be printed as a non-legal card. With cards like Far Out that don't have clear rulings around, it becomes even more strange that they took the initiative to go back and clarify the rulings on Animate Objects specifically. And at number 7, we have Canoptek Wraith. This is a 2/1 Wraith artifact creature with the mana cost of 3. As printed, it has the abilities where it can't be blocked, and whenever Canoptek Wraith deals combat damage to a player, you pay 3 and sacrifice it. If you do, you search your library for up to 2 basic land cards with the same name as a land you control, put them into the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. The errata is a small wording change. It now says you may choose a land you control, then search your library for up to 2 basic land cards that share a name with that land. Essentially, it was rewritten to more properly explain exactly how the card worked. The original wording made it seem like you could find any 2 basic lands as long as both of them shared a name with the land you controlled. For example, if you had a swamp and a mountain, it sounded like you could find a swamp and mountain and ramp them both out. However, this was never how the card was supposed to work. Instead, how it worked was if you had both a swamp and mountain, you could find either 2 swamps or 2 mountains and cheat them both out. The new wording was designed just to make this more clear. Wizards seems to have always had an issue with this kind of effect. The card Myriad Landscape also allows you to find 2 copies of the same basic land and ram them into play, but in order for this to work, it has to specifically mention the land type of the cards you're finding. It also has a wording that's entirely different to that of Canoptek Wraith, though that likely has to do with the fact that the Wraith needs the lands to be the same as the one you control. This type of effect is difficult to write in a way that isn't extremely wordy and confusing at first blush. So it's not that surprising that they had to go back and clarify the effect more clearly. This card also hasn't gotten a reprint, so the only available copies have the mistake on them. And at number 6, we have Walking Atlas. As printed, this is a 1/1 construct creature with a mana cost of 2. It is the ability where you can tap it to put a card from your hand onto the battlefield. This is the first time on this list the mistake is found on a card's type line. From the card's artifact frame, you may have assumed that it was an artifact creature, but it's not actually on the card's type line. As printed, it's only a creature, and it had to be errata to be an artifact creature. Interestingly, the next set in this block, Rise of the Eldrazi, did include a number of colorless creatures that aren't artifacts, namely the Eldrazi. These cards very clearly had a different border than Walking Atlas did. The only spells in the entire block that are colorless are cards with the Eldrazi type, making it even more clear that the card was never intended to be a non-artifact. Once again, this is a card that has never been given another reprint. Every time Wizards has wanted to return to this kind of effect, they've instead printed a card like Scaled Herbalist or Llanowar Scout. The main difference here seems to be that these are all green cards, unlike Atlas, which could be used in any deck. Land Ramp is a primarily green effect, with Atlas being a bit of a bend of the color pie to work alongside Zendikard's landfall mechanic, which triggers whenever a land enters the field under your control. However, outside of that context, the card isn't very necessary, and Wizards has found other ways to do landfall synergies in subsequent visits to the plane. As a result, it's not that uncommon to see Atlas in random mono-white or mono-red commander decks, despite needing Gatherer on hand to deal with any possible confusions that arise. And at number 5, we have Dynaheir, Invoker Adept. This is a legendary 4/4 human wizard with a mana cost of 1, 1 blue, 1 red, and 1 white. As printed, it has haste, meaning you can attack with it and use its tap abilities the turn it enters the battlefield. It also has the abilities where you can activate the activated abilities of other creatures you control as though they had haste, and you can tap it to make it so the next time you activate an ability by spending 4 more mana to activate it, you copy that ability, then you can choose new targets for the copy. The errata to this card is to the final ability. It now reads, when you next activate an ability that isn't a mana ability this turn by spending 4 more mana to activate it, copy that ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. This mana ability restriction is there mostly due to a niche rules interaction. Mana abilities are a very special type of ability with a lot of specific rules baggage. You see, mana abilities, as a rule, don't use the stack. They sorta just happen. As a consequence of this ruling, Dynaheir, even as originally written, couldn't actually copy mana abilities. However, if you activated a mana ability that costs 4 to activate, and then activated another card like Chaos Wand, you wouldn't get the copy of the Chaos Wand ability. You see, at the time that you would activate Wand, it wouldn't be the next ability activated that had met the criteria. Even though it couldn't trigger when you activated the mana ability, that was the next time you activated an ability that cost 4 or more. So it would effectively use up your Dynaheir activation. So the Errata was done to prevent these types of negative interactions. Funnily enough, there are only a few cards with mana abilities this expensive. The vast majority of mana abilities cost 0 or only 1 or 2 mana at most to activate, which makes sense as otherwise you probably wouldn't generate any mana at all. While it may be a small change, the Errata to Dynaheir would make the card a lot more fun to play with. And at number 4, we have Delina Wild Mage. This is a 3/2 legendary elf shaman with a mana cost of 3 and 1 red. As printed, it has the ability where whenever it attacks, you choose target creature you control, then roll a d20. On a 1 to a 14, you make a tapped attacking token that's a copy of the targeted creature, except it's not legendary and has exile this at the end of combat. On a 15 to 20, you instead make one of those tokens, then roll again. The Errata changed the last line of its ability from roll again to you may roll again. This means that the ability is now optional, which quickly proved to be very important. You see, in the same set, there was a card called Pixie Guide. This creature costs 2 mana and has the ability where, whenever you would roll 1 or more die, you instead roll that many dice plus 1 and ignore the lowest roll. This ability does stack, so having multiple guides would make your rolls exponentially better. However, this ended up being a big problem with the original Delina. If you have enough copies of Pixie Guide, rolling a 15 or higher would essentially be guaranteed. While this would normally be really good, as it means you would make an infinite number of guides with Delina's attack trigger, the issue is that you could never stop. You were forced to roll again if you hit. So the ability to roll 15s or higher quickly goes from a blessing to a curse. Since this is a random ability, you can't skip over the permutations to the resulting game state like you can for most similar loops. This means you'll manually have to roll for each version of the loop, slowly watching as your chances of ever escaping this dice-based purgatory slowly diminish. The end result is essentially soft-locking the game, forcing a draw. This Errata was pretty welcomed. You still have to manually roll if you pull off this loop, but once you make 20 or so guides, you can just choose to stop and go for the kill. This simple Errata not only fixed this issue with the card, but it actually made it even more powerful. And at number 3, we have Marath, Will of the Wild. This is a 0/0 legendary elemental beast with a mana cost of 1 green, 1 red, and 1 white. As printed, it has the abilities where it enters with a number of counters equal to the amount of mana he has spent to cast it. It also has the ability where you can pay X mana and remove X +1/+1 counters to choose one. You put X +1/+1 counters on target creature, or Marath deals X damage to any target, or you create an XX green elemental creature token. The Errata adds one simple restriction to the activated ability. X can't be 0. You see, originally, you would be able to pay no mana and remove no counters to activate the ability, which with 2 of the 3 modes did nothing at all. However, the ability to make a 0/0 elemental creature token for 0 mana pretty much immediately became a problem. While the creature would just die immediately to state-based actions, there are plenty of ways around this. The first use you might think of is combining the ability with cards like Intangible Virtue to buff all your tokens, giving them at least 1 toughness. This would let you make an army of infinite tokens, which would allow you to attack all of your opponents for lethal on your next turn, or immediately if you have a card like Concordant Crossroads to give them all haste. However, this is actually unnecessary. Even if the creature dies immediately, they still enter the battlefield first. This means that cards that care about your creatures entering early in the battlefield will still trigger. Using a card like Soul's Attendant or Impact Tremors to gain life or deal damage off of the tokens, respectively, can let you win the game on the spot. This wouldn't have mattered too much in a 60-card format, but in Commander, the format that Marath was designed for, this would essentially make these cards 1-card combos. Thanks to how overpowered this would be, Marath was instantly errated to be more aligned with other commanders. And this is one of the few cards in this list that actually got a reprint with its new text. And at number 2, we have Invasion of Vryn. This is a battle with a mana cost of 3 and 1 blue. As printed, when it enters the field, you draw 3 cards and then discard a card. It has 4 defense counters, and like all battles, when they're removed, you exile it and cast it transformed. The backside is Overloaded Mage Ring. This is an artifact with ability where you can pay 1, tap it, and sacrifice it to copy target spell you control. The errata to the card affected the Mage ring, adding a single line of text to the activated ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. This is a line of text that shows up on basically every spell that copies instants or sorcery spells, and for good reason. Without this line of text, the card would be far less useful. By default, any spell you copy would target the same thing as the original. Copying spells like burn spells or basically any kind of removal spell would essentially be useless, because they would both just try to remove the same thing. They likely forgot to put this line here originally because Mage Ring can copy any spell, not just an instant or sorcery. You can't change the targets of a card like Tarmogoyf, so having that text on an ability that can copy threats just reads strange. Still, the text is necessary for the card to be able to copy instant and sorcery spells properly, which is why the card needed to be errated, despite the fact the card technically worked without any changes. And at number 1, we have Hostage Taker. This is a 2/3 human pirate with a mana cost of 2, 1 blue and 1 black. As printed, it has the ability where, when Hostage Taker enters the battlefield, you exile target artifact or creature until Hostage Taker leaves the battlefield. For as long as it remains exiled, you may cast that card, and you can spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast it. The errata is very simple. They change the ability from exiling target artifact or creature to another target artifact or creature, essentially meaning that you can't target itself. This ends up having a much bigger impact on how the card plays than you might think. If you target a Hostage Taker with its own ability, it'll return itself to the field immediately once it leaves the field. This will technically mean that Hostage Taker has left the field and re-entered the battlefield again. This, in turn, will cause it to trigger all over again, meaning you have to exile another creature. Normally, you could just exile another creature instead of the Hostage Taker to break the loop, but if there are no other targets on the field, you would be forced to repeat this loop over and over again. Most other similar effects nowadays, such as Banishing Light, say that you can only target cards your opponent controls, so they don't need the another restriction. What sets Hostage Taker apart from most of the other cards that require Day 1 erratas is a combination of the card being both very powerful and the mistake being very relevant to gameplay. Before the errata, you basically couldn't cast Hostage Taker on an empty board. You often wouldn't want to, but with the fixed version, you still can without breaking the game. However, this mistake alone wouldn't be that notable if Hostage Taker was average pack builder, which it was not. Hostage Taker was printed in Ixalan, a famously weak set, where it was not only a powerful high rarity card, but also one of the few cards worth playing in the set. One of the main reasons to open packs of original Ixalan was to get copies of Hostage Taker. Having one of the most powerful cards in the set have a mistake that was very notable meant that Hostage Taker's errata is maybe the most famous instance of a Day 0 errata in the game. Basically, everyone knew about the errata because you had to in order to play during that standard. There really hasn't been another card that was simultaneously this prominent and with such a large errata, easily securing the top spot on this list. Alright, and that's the video. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos similar to this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.